Thanks, Tom. As always, that news was depressing. Welcome back to Story Kitchen, where today we're going to assemble a story salad for our character using some just fresh, simple ingredients. Now, as always, we want to start with a base for our story salad, and this is comprised of some themes, some character arcs for our character, some personality traits that we can latch onto throughout the plot. Now, my personal preference for this part of the salad is to toss it. Next up, we have some backstory for our character. Let's get some of that nice backstory and just sprinkle that in. That's some good stuff right there. And next up, we want to add some backstory. We're going to take some of this backstory, we're just going to ladle that in, and we're not going to worry too much because we're going to mix this up in a bit. And next up, one of my favorite parts, I can never decide between seasoning a story salad with salt or craisins. Once I used both and it just, too over-salted, too seasoned. We're going to take some of this backstory craisin and mix that in there too. And finally, let's just get some of this before we start up with our ranch backstory. A lot of backstory going on. I see you starting to comment down below that you would totally eat this. You wouldn't, and that's a weird hill to die on, especially if you're trying to just prove something about excessive backstory that I say later on in the video. We're going to take some of our backstory here. We're just going to drizzle this over. Zoom in if you can see that. This is just room temperature ranch, my absolute favorite. Oh man, look at that backstory. Our character is becoming so well seasoned. And finally, the last thing, just a little bit of backstory. What is this thing? All right. We're going to garnish our character with just a bit of backstory on top, and there you have a story salad that you can make at home with just some fresh, simple ingredients. What if I've become more interested in my character's backstory than their main story, their front story? It's a really interesting question. It's one that's been most recently asked by Tsuni-chan, but a lot of people have brought up before. Now, a character's backstory is just all the stuff that's happened with them before we meet them. And I've said before that a backstory is a lot like world building, setting up all of the secondary details and tertiary elements of a story. But the thing about world building is, if you're not careful, it can quickly become a cart before the horse type situation. Of course, making your character's backstory is necessary to a certain extent, but let's talk about why that is. In your main story, the one that comes after the backstory, your character needs to have an arc, a certain amount of change that they go through from beginning to end. Otherwise, they just remain static and unchanged. And at that point, there's no real emotional reason for your story to have existed. So the backstory is just setting that up. How did our character get where they are when we meet them? Sometimes backstories are treated like biographies. They are paragraph or paragraphs long stories that cover all the details. But just keep in mind that the best stories out there aren't the best because they're abridged, abbreviated, cramming as much detail as they can down into a small form. So just because you add more detail doesn't mean that someone is going to end up caring more. You should also be careful that you aren't just starting your story off, giving everything away in a giant pile of exposition. Remember that stories are about the journey. My first solution for this problem of caring more about the backstory than the main story has to do with re-examining the main story itself. Now, is the backstory more interesting because the main story just isn't compelling? Are there themes running throughout your story, or is it just a series of events or a plot? Is your character going through an arc? Now, the second solution might seem obvious, but take a look at the backstory. Is there a series of things happening? Is your character going through a change? Is he surpassing something, struggling with something? Well, that's a story in and of itself. Now you got two stories. Congratulations. Some folks like to create backstories with a lot of tragedy in them. We call that a tragic backstory. The idea being that if you front load the character with a lot of bad things that have happened to them, we will then empathize with them and then start to care. The problem with that is, though, it's a lot like having a lot of sugar or salt all at once without having something to balance it out. Or even better, it's like a salad that's made up of exclusively toppings. Oh. Now, there is one case that I can think of where, not necessarily a tragic backstory, but a backstory that consists of a short summary of the character's life up until this point is actually more useful than harmful. And that's in a video game where you have a large cast of characters. Some developers will use this as a narrative device when creating a character in order for you to care about them in a short amount of time, even though this character is part of a game that doesn't follow a linear narrative. My friend Mark and I have a show called Character Select on this channel where we do exactly this. We come up with a very silly game character and give them mechanics, some art, and a backstory. My second idea is tragic front story.
Oh no. Wow. Does this mean I can't have a tragic backstory? Oh no. What does this mean? Does this mean the tragedy is currently happening? That's even sadder.
Or yet to happen.
Oh, tragic front story.
Now, this style or form of backstory is almost like a movie trailer for the character. A story that doesn't have a definitive ending. Here's where they came from, here's what they've been through, and here's what they're going to do in the present or in the future. Now, there are a lot of great examples of backstory in media, but for this video, I want to focus on just one, and it's sort of the masterclass of backstory storytelling, and that's the show Lost. Now, you may have been let down by the way that that show handled its mysteries, and maybe the last few seasons weren't all the way there, but there are three huge things that you can learn from the way that Lost did backstories, and that's through expectation, exposition, and relevance. Now, I'll try doing this without spoiling anything in the show, if you're worried about something being spoiled 10 years after it started airing. A bunch of strangers crash on an island, and the best episodes of Lost follow a certain formula to tell you something about a character. First is that expectation. Either in scenes on the island or in a flashback, Lost sets a character up in a way that either confirms a stereotype, makes you dismiss them, or even causes you to dislike them. Then Lost gives you some exposition. It feeds you a little piece of another story. It's either a parallel situation to the main story or just a really compelling mystery on its own. You're never really bored or uninterested during a flashback, except for in one group of episodes, but I'll get to that in a minute. Finally, there's relevance. At a certain point, it's revealed or we begin to grasp why that backstory was important. Maybe that expectation that we had at the beginning, where we might have even hated a character, has been flipped on its head. Maybe something from that character's past is now useful in the situation that they're in now. Or simply we understand why a character did what they did based on their backstory. And that's how you want to use backstory, as a tool that informs the main story, not just to info dump or give a bunch of irrelevant information. Now, I mentioned an exception, a point in time when the backstories in Lost, the flashbacks, weren't interesting at all. And it's actually from a series of episodes in the beginning of Season 3. Now, these 6 episodes or so move a lot slower than the rest of the story in Lost, and one of the episodes focuses entirely on how the character Jack got his tattoos in the flashbacks and backstory. And this story is only a little bit relevant to the story on the island. Now, what is interesting is the story behind the scenes of these episodes. This group of episodes was made during a time when the creators of the show were fighting with the studio. The studio, seeing how successful Lost was, wanted it to run on as long as possible indefinitely until it just wasn't popular anymore. But the creators of the show had a specific ending in mind for it, and they wanted a finite amount of seasons to reach that end point. So this group of episodes is kind of like a window into a scenario where Lost was allowed to just run on indefinitely. Now, whether or not you liked the ending of Lost, whether it let you down or it just wasn't your cup of tea, there's no denying the control that it had over its character development and its backstory, especially considering the large ensemble of characters there was. If you're struggling with a backstory, try not to use it just to make us feel bad about a character, but to take us on a journey with them. And instead of throwing all of the information at us at once, try to weave pieces of that backstory into the story when it's most relevant. If you control backstory with expectation, exposition, and relevance, you can avoid falling into a trap where you're simply just world building. I'm making 2 new videos a week here on Character Design Forge, not Story Kitchen. Subscribing on YouTube lets you know when new videos are made available. If you'd like to support me and this channel, you can go to patreon.com/bageldenizen and get a ton of things in return. Thank you to all of these people who are currently supporting me on Patreon. It means so much, and I really appreciate it. My social media things, Twitter, Instagram, Twitch, it's Bagel Denizen on all of them. Bagel Denizens as far as the eye can see. Thank you so much for watching, and have fun creating.